Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Welcome. In our show today, we're going to take a look at bridging the gap, the path towards human-level AI. Just a reminder, though, first, this is the final show in season 2, and we're going to take a couple of weeks off, so show will be dark until January, and then the first episode in season 3 will drop on January 6th. So let me bring my guest in. There we go, Michael. So this is... I'm joined here by Michael Azoff, Chief Analyst on Omdia's Cloud and Data Center team, author of a couple of books, including a recent one that's very relevant to what we're going to talk about today, Toward Human-Level AI. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks so much, Michael, as well. And I'm very pleased to be on your show. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That won't be confusing with the name thing at all, I guess. So. So why don't we start by just you doing a quick intro. Tell us a little bit about what you do at Omdia.
Sure. So I work as a high-tech industry analyst at Omdia in the Cloud and Data Center practice. I cover all things software development, but I have a huge interest in AI and currently looking at how AI is transforming the software development world. So that's very topical right now. But I have a long background in neural networks prior to being an industry analyst. I worked with neural nets. I had a startup. I built neural networks for forecasting. I looked at electricity price forecasting for a power utility. And I wrote a book on that topic, neural network time series forecasting of financial markets as well, because that was a very topical subject as well at the time. But yeah, so my interest in neural nets goes way back from the beginning of backpropagation. So this is a sort of second life for me with AI, with the current initiative since deep learning.
Yeah, it's exciting. I mean, it's certainly gotten everybody's attention, and I, like you, I've been involved with it for quite a while, but it's over the last couple of years, I think, we've gotten this sort of broad recognition of what's happening, and things are moving very quickly. And so I'm curious. In your book, Toward Human-Level Artificial Intelligence, you explore some of the challenges that's facing AI and, as it tries to reach this human level capability. So what do you think the biggest gap is between what we have today, and obviously that's evolving every day, and then what would, true human level intelligence look like?
Right. So there's a number of aspects to this because when we're talking about gaps, there's also a gap in neuroscience. There is a huge amount of data and understanding at a very detailed empirical level of chemical processes, electrical processes at the synapse, the axon, the neuron level. A huge amount of data. In fact, there's so much that it's just difficult to see the wood from the trees and to try and find some systematic structure to all of this data. And that's at the sort of, if you like, the low level of neuroscience. And then at the higher level, cognitive psychology, there is a lot of understanding of those functions of the brain and how they work. But the gap is between connecting those two layers and having a theory of intelligence and how all that data that we have at the empirical level, how that relates to the cognitive level. So that's a gap in a neuroscience. And similarly, we have the gap in AI because we're doing some marvelous things with the latest generation of large language models, but we are yet to achieve human level capabilities. Despite some remarkable properties of large language models today, there's still a big gap, and I can delve into that if you like. I've recently given a talk and talked about some of the limitations of large language models. They hallucinate. They find it difficult at times to tell the difference between fact and fiction. they're what I slightly unkindly describe them as being brain dead, because once you input the data and they have processed it and given you an answer, they sort of go to sleep. There's nothing going on inside the machine, and that is very unlike the intelligence of animal brains and so on.
Right.
And there's no and that also reflects the fact that there's no inner motivation, there's no inner drive. So we can talk about characteristics of the human brain, which we would like to see in an artificial brain. So, for example, we can talk about the embodied brain, because we have evolved with contact with the physical world. We experiment, we embodied brain, that we interact with the external world, the physical world, and this has been reflected in the evolution of our intelligence and brain. So having an embodied a body tied with our brain, I think is quite important. And I know that there are many engineers in AI that are now exploring creating robots with brains and having them interact. It's not just putting an AI on top of an existing mechanical robot, because that doesn't really quite work. But it's actually evolving the two together in synchrony as they learn about the external world. I think that is a quite important. So I talked about inner motivation, and it's this concept of outside in with the current models, as opposed to brains, animal brains, human brains, of being inside out. That even if you deprive all of our senses of information, we are still thinking, we are still, the neurons are still firing. Even when we're asleep, the neurons are firing.
Right.
So there is this activity inside our brain, and this is also our drive. We are motivated, we are curious, and in my book I talk about creating a neural robot that is acting like a scientist, because I think that's quite a nice role to give a robot, an artificial intelligence, to be curious about the world, to want to go out there and learn and perform trial and errors, and basically have an interest, and to accumulate knowledge. So that inner motivation, I think, is something that's completely lacking in our current models. The other aspect is visual thinking, and if you look at the history of evolution of animals on our planet, most animals have vision, and a large portion of the brain is dedicated to processing visual information. And it's very interesting that there are some people today who think totally visually, and most of us think in a combination of visual and verbal, but there are some people who are very visual. And I think we need to consider that before language was invented by human beings, we were visual animals.
Yeah.
And most creatures are are visual, right?
Yeah.
So so vision is important, visual processing is important, visual thinking, and I'm sort of making that connection, that I talk about consciousness without self-awareness as being a sort of simpler kind of consciousness, but I think there's a connection between that and visual thinking. Now, I need to make clear, in my book, I make a very clear distinction between what is evidence-based and what is conjectural. So the first part of my book is just a sort of historical introduction, and then the next two parts are surveys on the evidence, if you like. One part is on neuroscience, one part is on AI research. So that is the evidence. And then the more conjectural aspects, which is what I've touched on about visual thinking and how that relates to consciousness, it is more conjectural, but I think it is interesting to talk about it. I'm not seeing that conversation happen elsewhere, and I am trying to connect the dots. So hopefully that will stimulate people. So yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, I think when we think of, moving towards human level intelligence, or AGI, it seems like we focus a lot on the technology, which that's, I guess that seems obvious, and we're all involved in technology and technology research, so that's logical too. But it's interesting to hear the gaps on the neurological side. And so I know your book, you draw heavily on that, and as you just said, you had a whole section. So how do advancements in understanding the human brain accelerate this progress towards human level AI?
Well, I think that despite my huge admiration and joy, if you like, at the success of engineered AI
Mm,
today, I think it's marvelous, and I'm a technological optimist,
mm,
and
yeah.
I think that there's a lot of good that will benefit mankind from this research.
Mm,
So, but I think that this current line of work will only get so far, and I think they will need to go back to neuroscience for inspiration on what to do next. And so this was my aim with looking at neuroscience,
mm,
is to see, well, what aspects are relevant for understanding the next level, to get to the
mm,
next level. I mean, just to take a few examples, our brain is split between left and right hemispheres.
mm,
There is research that shows that that has a very strong connection with three-dimensional vision. That
mm,
the way the brain is split and the way the wires cross over between signals of left and right eye linked to different left and right
mm,
hemispheres. So there's a very interesting paper that relates this to the mathematics of three-dimensional vision.
mm,
Um, so, but um, I'm also speculating that there could be that this could also have helped in terms of intelligence. I don't know. It's a question, but
mm,
I think what is interesting is that um, as far as I can tell, I won't say all animals, but most animals that I've
mm,
looked at have this left right split.
mm,
Lateralizate brain lateralization is another term that the neuroscientists use,
mm,
it's everywhere. So that there has to be, you know, there has to be something there, because that has evolved with our intelligence.
mm,
So that is one aspect.
yeah.
I've looked at the junctions in between neurons, and we know the familiar axon connects to the synapse, which
Mm,
converts the electrical spike into a neuro transmitting a chemical process, which then creates an electrical spike in the receiving neuron, and so on. But there are also pure electrical junctions in the brain, and
mm,
there are also what are called ephaptic connections, where the electrical fields between axons
mm,
affect each other. So there are all these additional processes going on, which I think
mm,
is quite interesting. Um, I also found a very interesting paper that looked at the input-output processing in a single neuron, and they ended up by replicating it, you creating a deep learning neural model that had 17 deep layers just to reflect the input-output processes of this single neuron. So our existing neurons are very, very simplified um, models of what is actually in our brains.
mm,
So again, I think these aspects of the real brain um, could lead to some new models and new thinking about what we
mm.
should be creating in AI.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, the way you describe it, and I guess I would have accepted this that human intelligence is very complex, or in some ways nuanced and complex, which is an interesting combination. So, being a little more specific, and you gave us some of these already, but what are the characteristics and capabilities that you'd say are unique that define this human level, and then how far is our current AI technology from that, do you think?
Mm. So I think what is so exciting about the current work are these emergent properties in large language models. There
Mm,
was a paper written from Google in 2022, in August 2022, so that's just a few months before ChatGPT was launched.
mm, mm,
And they looked at a number of different models, and they increased the number of parameters in each of these large language models. And they found that when they had hit, so they were benchmarking them against a whole variety of tests. tests that were designed to be difficult for AI to perform well.
Mhm.
So as they increased the size of these of each of these models by billions, there was sort of zero performance on these benchmarks, and all of a sudden, when they hit about 10 billion, the chart starts to go up.
Mhm.
And there's another really interesting chart that came out of the Stanford AI Index. It's a report that is published by the Stanford team yearly. It's called AI Index Report.
Mhm.
And if you look at the latest one from March this year, you can just see that all these benchmarks are sort of, they're all converging on human level capability as we track
Mhm.
these by year. It'll be interesting to see the March 2025.
Yeah.
Um, but you know, when you run these benchmarks that are designed to be difficult for AI to perform well, and you see this improvement, it's really exciting. And I've done experiments. I've run puzzles that are difficult to do, and I've reposed them so that to make sure that they hadn't appeared in the training with a sort of one-to-one
Mm.
correspondence, but reset them. And I found, for example, that OpenAI's O1 model was able to solve a really tricky
Mm.
puzzle,
Yeah.
which the version ChatGPT 4.0 couldn't. So there is definitely emergent these emergent properties. I think what they're doing is, and I agree with Jeffrey Hinton when he says that higher level concepts are being extracted out of the data. It isn't
Mhm.
just purely
Yeah.
what's the next word in the sequence. There are high level concepts that are being played with in the LLM.
Mm.
There is more research being done, and we need to do more. We need to understand more, but there is something very interesting there. It's not, it may not be human level AI, but it is, from an engineering
Right.
point of view, it is absolutely fascinating.
Mm.
And it's clever enough and good enough to be useful in the real world. And I
Mm.
think that this, I know there's a lot of hype out there with the current interest in generative AI, clearly, but I think there is substance there as well. And I think
Yep.
this is the substance that will continue
Mm.
and will continue to be developed.
Yeah. I mean, today's systems can do some pretty amazing things, and I know, a lot of people when they use it and they get a more exposure to it, they are, they're, especially with O1, which you call out. I mean, the reasoning model, that capability does advance quite a bit over the experiences I've had with all the other models. So there's still this depth of understanding that you have from the human that you don't see, and it was interesting your statement, I think, about what happens when the model goes to sleep versus what happens when the human goes to sleep, right? I mean, my brain doesn't shut down, the model shuts down, and so there's not that additional layer happening there. So what do you think the biggest shortcomings are with what we have, including O1, that prevent this from taking that next step into the human level
Yes.
abilities?
So, yeah. So I think what would be useful is to marry an area of AI research that has been going for many decades now, and that's cognitive architectures,
Mm.
because they are based on a continuous loop, a continuous evaluation. And I think if we can put something like that into a neural network type
Mhm.
model, maybe with lots of different ensembles of neural nets, then for me, it is a little bit like how the human brain, how the baby's brain evolves, because it has
Mm.
a blueprint. Neurons know how to connect to each other. It's very interesting, and in fact, this is one of the joys of doing that neuroscience research, is to learn about these things. So the best way to think about the baby's brain is like a block of marble, and there are more neurons and axons in the baby's brain than at any other time in our life.
Mm.
What then happens is that this block of marble is chiseled away to form the sculpture.
Mm.
A lot of the neurons die and are terminated. The ones that make
Mm.
good connections are retained. So we start off with this absolute explosion of neurons everywhere, but they do have a blueprint. They know where they need to get to, and the ones that succeed are the ones that thrive. The ones that don't are die. And so I think that this idea of a blueprint is something that we obviously carry with our genes, and this is, if you like, a starting point architecture, and I conjecture that the equivalent of that in an AI would be to have some kind of cognitive architecture that creates an initial structure, but then you add a lot of neurons for the learning. So it could be that work that was done in the cognitive architecture world is relevant for going forwards with AGI.
Yeah. Interesting, because I mean, I know this year there's been some movement around this idea that rather than having to train the LLM, we could build an LLM that is self-perpetuating, it's self-training. Liquid foundation models, I know, is one of the terms that I've heard applied to that. So that does sort of start to bridge towards what you're talking about. If the model could actually, self teach and learn over time, that does, I mean, it's not necessarily the definition you have, but it does seem like we're moving faster in that direction than maybe we thought.
Yes, and that I think there's a connection between that and evolutionary computing and evolutionary algorithms that evolve, and a sort of Darwinian process where the one that the technique that succeeds continues, and so I mean I think I can quite understand why they are experimenting with these models, and I think there is such an explosion and such a huge investment going into AI at the moment that it'll be interesting to see what emerges. I mean, it could well be that the current approach will actually achieve AGI, but I think if the current approach does succeed, that it'll be interesting to compare it with an animal brain, because I think they'll hit a point where there are parallels. So I just think that the animal brain, the human brain, is the best example of intelligence. It's the only example that we have, and so it would be odd if there weren't parallels between the engineered approach, the purely engineered approach. But I also think that if by going back to neuroscience and taking the inspiration from what we are learning about the brain, the human brain, and there is so much going on at the moment that there are new techniques for delving non-destructively, measuring and monitoring what is going on in the brain, that I think that this will help the AGI efforts. But yeah.
I mean, when we get there, when we get to AGI in some form, and I mean, there's arguments about what that really looks like, I guess. But what are the implications for businesses, though? I mean, it's easy to think about it and get excited about a machine that thinks like a human, but what does that mean for business? And what are the use cases that you think are exciting, and then which ones maybe are a little on the scary side?
So clearly, this is technology that we do need to monitor and govern, because there's obviously we know the reality of politics in the human world, and the use of any technology for warfare. And I think this is where, for example, we have constraints on biological weapons, on nuclear weapons, and I think we should have similar constraints on use of AI in warfare, so that we don't self-destruct, basically. So putting that to one side, there are other serious implications of what this technology how it will impact our society. And I think we just need to come to terms with this new world. I don't think we can turn the clock back. And I'm very positive about this technology because I think it has so much to offer. And I think we have ways of learning from that technology as well. If you look at what's happening with our planet and climate change, where if things continue as they are and there's no change, um, there's going to be a calamity and a catastrophe in the future for the next
Yep.
few generations. So, if AI is able to help us reduce that kind of finale,
Yeah.
that kind of future, then that is a very positive thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think the nature of jobs will change. Hopefully, people will have more value, uh, jobs that have more job satisfaction, that add more value, and less chores, because you can let the machines automate more.
Mm.
Um, so it is a new future. There's no doubt about it. But you know we can't we can't keep things static. Change is
Right.
part of how things are, and this is this isn't we shouldn't try to keep keep the clock from going forwards.
Right.
If I'm here, I am in the United Kingdom. If the United Kingdom says, "Look, we think AI is going to alter our jobs in such a way that people they're frightened of the change, so we'll put an end to AI," but other
Mm.
countries will not do that. So
Right.
what will happen to the United Kingdom? They just fall behind.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure that we're on top of this technology, everyone, in the democratic world, more
Mm.
than any other part of the world. And I think that we should keep on top of this technology. We should govern it, make sure it's not going to be misused and destroy us. But
Right.
at the same time, I think it will do us a lot of good. I honestly do think that.
Mm.
Yeah.
I just read a report the other day, and this kind of reminds me of it. We were actually discussed it on my last episode a bit of development that came out of China. Apparently, as a part of their policing efforts, they've developed an AI-driven robotic police person, I guess, or police machine, and and so it goes out with the humans and has the capability to stun and use tear gas and I don't know, whatever. So I mean, obviously that's some of the concern, and particularly it's interesting the distinction you made between the democratic world and some of the other countries that are going to develop this, and we know they're working on some of this. So I guess that makes me wonder, like, what are the ethical, societal concerns other than that, which is obviously bad. But what do we need to be mindful of? And then as we're going through the research, and I'm very positive on AI as well, and I also think, in some ways they will say in the trains left the station, we're not putting it back in. So
Mm.
so how do we go forward safely, and are there other things that we should think about as a society?
Yes. So in authoritarian society, it is very unfortunate the way this technology is being used to enforce
Yeah.
authority, and trample on people's human rights. I think that's not a good thing. All we can do is set an example of how we think humans should live with dignity and freedom, and just try to create a way of life that is an example to other societies who
Mm.
eventually, hopefully, will want to have a similar standard of life and freedom.
Mm.
I think eventually all authoritarian societies fall. I mean, that's what we've seen in the past, and
Right.
hopefully that will be the case with current authoritarian societies. Um, but as I say, at least in our societies, we can set rules, and we can govern this technology so that it isn't misused. That's the best we can do, I
Yeah.
think.
I mean, it is interesting that, obviously historically, you're right. The authoritarian regimes have classically fallen apart at some level, but it is a little bit concerning in my mind about the fact that they can exercise much more control. The more the systems evolve, the more control they do, and then you wonder, in a society with it, all of the facial recognition and all the other technologies and all it. I mean, it is concerning. I think does that perpetuate it, right?
Yeah, no, it is a concern. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things, and actually we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'm curious about this. I wanted to think about this a little bit because one of the really unique things about humans is our ability to adapt. As we move forward, to adapt to different tasks, to things we haven't seen before, we can kind of put that together and solve those riddles. How does that contrast with adaptability in our current models, our current systems? And then what do you think? How do we close the gap with that?
Mm. Well, our current models can be a little brittle. They're very good at solving specific challenges, but they can be shown to be quite brittle and fragile at times. And the more research that's done on that, the better it is to create improvements so that they're less fragile. But it is in the nature of the current models that they're just not as adaptable and agile as the human brain. There's no doubt about it. But it is, yeah. So as I mentioned, there is that gap in neuroscience that we have all this information, we have understanding at the low level, the cognitive level. We don't know how the two connect and how. But maybe if we do crack that challenge, that will impact tremendously how we build the next generation of artificial intelligence. And maybe then it'll be, if we actually understand human intelligence, we'll then be able to create an artificial one. But I think it's possible that we can apply as we're improving our AI models so well, we can apply them to all that data in neuroscience, and maybe the AI can come up with some interesting models of how the human brain actually functions. So there could be a two-way sort of process there, where we use these machines to help us understand ourselves. But yeah.
I mean, that's a unique approach, and obviously we're already starting to move into AI that's taking action for us, agentic AI, and this kind of new big push, automation, intelligent automation, I should say, because we've had automation for a while, but that's logic based, not intelligence based. So as we take out our crystal ball for a minute, if we look to the future a bit, and obviously things have evolved so quickly over the last 2 or 3 years, but are there things that you see on the horizon right now, emerging technologies or approaches even? And for example, I guess you just gave us one. Maybe the AI actually helps solve the neuroscience questions that then help us solve the machine human level intelligence question. So that's one, I guess. But are there other things that make you optimistic about that gap, closing the gap, and getting to the human level capabilities?
Mm. So, I think the agentic AI is an interesting approach because it's very much about intent-based modeling, if you like, where you tell the machine what you want, and then the machine figures out how to achieve it. All the conversations that I've had so far is that this is still very much a work in progress. I think some are a little bit more ahead in agentic AI than others. But it is there's a lot of aspiration there, and I think that there's a lot of focus of investment and research. So we're yet to see the full fruits of that, I think, in next year and the next couple of years. So it is very much at the forefront. But yeah, so I think one of the things I haven't mentioned is neuromodulation, is how the brain rewards actions in the brain, and this to some extent sort of connects with reinforcement type of learning processes, which DeepMind has been so successful with. But I think that's a rich area for explorations, where I think we've hardly touched on how the different neuromodulators in the brain work, and how that could be used in an AI model. It's I think that's an area ripe for further work. And I don't know if I ran through my list of possible uh, 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 connections between the uh, um, so there's one thing that I haven't mentioned, which is how we accumulate knowledge and how we are able to learn quickly with a few examples, and build knowledge and accumulate it, and not have what in the days of deep learning was known as catastrophic forgetting. I think with large language models that is less of an issue now, which is interesting. But it's still a challenge of having this accumulation of learning and being able to take one model from one domain into another. And we're doing that a little bit with foundation models and RAG, which is able to add new data. But I think that can be taken further. I mean, certainly the brain is so, as you said, so agile and is so good at this ability to be applied to anything. And we've yet to see that with the AI model. So I think that's an area that would be really interesting to explore. But I think the other thing that we haven't touched on at all is that the current trends, and they're working towards trillion parameter models, is that they're going to run out of energy. And the major cloud service providers are all talking about commissioning nuclear reactors, because they're going to have these source of energies for the training. And then you think about the human brain, and it consumes the power of a light bulb, 20 watts. So my bet is on neuromorphic computing. I think because we just can't keep, powering these very power hungry models. We need to do a reset. And I think neuromorphic computing, where you have spikes, which are very energy efficient, you just have a spike and that's it, as opposed to having continuous signals which consume power. So neuromorphic computing, I think, which involves a degree of analog computing and memristors. And I think if memristors can be mass produced and are not fragile and can scale up, and if you marry memristors with neuromorphic analog machines, then I think we've got something really interesting. So I'm sort of hedging. I think, if you ask me where the progress will happen, I think it'll be on that front, because we're just going to run out of energy for these large language models with the sort of ambitions that people have got. I just don't think that it's possible. Certainly not today. I mean, we talk about Moore's law as well, which has continued to improve. And I did a recent talk where I predicted that if Moore's law does continue the way it has been, in 12 years' time, more or less, take a few years, we'll achieve AGI, because if we've solved the energy problem and used neuromorphic computing, and we've got so much improvement in computing performance that it frees up a lot of research teams to do experiments in a ways that's not possible today, because you have to be an open AI with multiple billions of dollars behind you to do this kind of level of research. But if your local university department can do these experiments, because Moore's law has sort of pushed us to the point where we can do these experiments, then I think that freedom of experimentation will lead to the next breakthrough. So if we put all of that together, I think we'll achieve AGI.
That's interesting, because that is a big, the constraints we have. You don't always think about how that plays into the ability to do research and almost democratize that research. If we can solve the power problem, we can move to a model where you have many, many, many more nodes in this research that could push it forward much more quickly. So that makes a lot of sense. So we're running out of time today, but I one of the things that interesting conversation first, so thank you for that. One of the things I like to do at the end of the show is just ask you for a recommendation for the audience. So somebody that you think, a thought leader, an author that you think it would be interesting for the audience to be aware of and take a look at.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I recently heard Angie Ma speak. She's a co-founder of a company called Faculty.ai. I think what the work they're doing is very interesting. It's very much about bringing AI into the enterprise world, and getting over the hurdles of the culture changes and adoption. And they're doing some really interesting work. So Angie Ma would be my recommendation for your next speaker.
Great. No, I appreciate it. That's a great recommendation. Well, Michael, a really interesting conversation today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Bye-bye.
And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arionresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arionresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arion Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.